This is chapter 10. This is one that we've discussed a little bit closer to where we are now, so it should be a little bit more fresh in your mind. I think this is going to be the last video that you're going to be watching that's made by me. I hope you've enjoyed the videos. So if I don't get to see you guys again, I just want to say make sure that you're studying for your final. Make sure you're working hard and you finish those handouts and all that stuff so you can get a good grade. Finish the year out strong. I hope I get to see you guys again before the end of the school year. But if I don't, it was a pleasure to teach you guys. And let's go ahead and jump right into this material and finish out the school year strong. Right. So animal classification. There's a couple things that we need to talk about here. Right. So first of all, what is an animal? Remember, a zoologist is a person that studies animals. In an animal, you have several characteristics. So first of all, animals are made of eukaryotic cells. What does that mean? All right, you should have thought of it by now. This means that they have a nucleus. Most specifically, means that they have a membrane-bound organelles. And that makes them different from other organisms. Another thing is that all animals are consumers. That's a really important concept. There are no animals that create their own energy. They have to eat in a certain way. Now, sometimes there are some animals that appear to have the ability to create their own energy, and that's actually typically through a form of symbiosis, where they get energy from something that they mutually benefit each other. But they have to consume. They can't create their own energy. They have to eat it somehow. Like it says there, most animals have specialized cells that do different tasks. And most animals need to move during a part of their life. So this is a really important thing, okay? Not all animals can move always. Now, for example, look at a butterfly, right? A butterfly can fly as an adult. There's a time where it's in the chrysalis and it doesn't move. So does it stop being an animal because it stops moving? No. So all animals can move at certain points in their lifetime. They may not be able to move at some points, but at some point in their lifetime they can. And another thing to consider is not just that they move from location to location so they can change where they are, but also that they're capable of moving the environment around them. And we see these in animals that are sessile, meaning that they can't move. So for example, a sponge or a coral is an animal that is sessile. It doesn't move. So what does it do? It actually can move the water around it to allow for filter feeding. Okay, so those are two types of movement where it can actually move, like locomote, change position, or it could actually move the environment around it. Okay, like it says there, most animals eat their food rather than merely absorb it. So that means that most animals have a mouth where they chew their food, swallow it, and then absorb it inside of their digestive system. And then a large majority of animals are going to reproduce sexually, even though some can reproduce asexually. Now, what's the difference there? Sexually, they need to have a partner and they exchange genetic information, whereas asexually, there's no partner requirement and the offspring are genetically identical. So think of mitosis. Okay, so some other characteristics is symmetry. Remember, this is like cutting the animal in half and opening and closing it like a book. The symmetry, there's a couple of different forms, like it says, can be divided by one or more imaginary lines into mirror images. For example, a human has bilateral symmetry. It has a line that you can cut straight down the middle and kind of have mirror halves. And that's what we call bilateral symmetry, when you can only cut it into basically two halves or one line. Then you have radial symmetry. This is any more than one line, okay? So examples of radial symmetry are going to be things like a starfish, or more specifically, or better name for it is called the sea star. And it's going to be cut in more than one way. And then asymmetry is an animal that can't be cut at all. An example of this is going to be a sponge. So no matter where you put that imaginary line, it won't be cut into equal halves. Okay. Then you have heads. So a lot of animals will have heads, not all of them. will have heads, but what we see in it is that there is cephalization, and this is the grouping of sensory organs in one place, and that place is typically the head. And what we mean by sensory organs are things like eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. See, I was like, how I pointed, all of those sensory organs in my body are localized in my head, but also the brain is also going to be localized in the head area as well. So that's what we call cephalization, and it's the grouping of sensory organs in the head. They also will have guts and body cavities. This is the opening of the digestive system, right? And there are two types of guts. You have a complete gut that have two distinct openings. They'll have a mouth and then an anus that allows for the excretion of waste. And then in some organisms, they have an incomplete gut, like you see here in this image right next to it. And instead of having two openings, they just have one. All right. Then a lot of animals have what we call a notochord, and this is found in animals that are chordates, meaning that at some point in life they'll have a backbone or a vertebrate. So not all animals will have a notochord. This is a flexible spinal cord, typically made out of cartilage, that gives the animal some structure. So chordates are animals that have a notochord, and most chordates, the notochord develops into a backbone. So the notochord is really only going to be present during the embryonic stage of the animal, meaning when the animal is developing, it's going to have a notochord, and eventually that notochord is going to become the backbone, the spinal column, or the spinal cord. Those organisms that develop a spinal cord are called vertebrates. And organisms that don't develop the spinal cord are going to be known as invertebrates. And some of those invertebrates will have animals that never have a notochord. So they will never have a backbone, or they'll never develop that notochord either, even during their embryonic stages. All right. There are also two types of ways that an animal can regulate their temperature. These are endotherms and ectotherms. So an endotherm, endo means inside, and that means that the animal regulates their body temperature internally, and this is going to be done through their metabolic processes. So things like cellular respiration, eating, moving, all these things are going to cause the body to regulate its body temperature. This is the real term for warm-blooded. So remember, we don't use the terms warm-blooded and cold-blooded anymore because those are misleading terms. You know, the blood isn't actually warm or actually cold, so we don't use those terms anymore. Right? But the endotherm means that the body temperature is controlled internally. So those are all warm-blooded organisms like mammals. Okay, and you have ectotherms. These are organisms that their bodies are regulated by their environment. Examples of these are reptiles that move out into the sun to warm up if they're cold, and if they're too hot, they'll go back into the water to cool off. So those are ectotherms, regulated by external things like their environment. All right, classifying animals, we'll go over this rather quickly. This is the study known as taxonomy, and you organize these organisms into that, what you see there, and there. So there are a couple different ways. Evolution is group organisms according to their evolutionary history, where creationists group organisms together according to their biblical kinds. And that study is called Baraminology. So Baraminology is the effort to define the boundaries between the various created kinds of animals. And those created kinds are what we see that God instructed these animals to get into the ark. All right, so invertebrates. Let's talk about some invertebrate characteristics. So all living things are vastly complex, even the invertebrates. So invertebrates are animals without a backbone, and all invertebrates are going to be ectotherms, meaning that they do not regulate their own temperature. The first type of invertebrate we're going to discuss, these are sponges. And sponges are animals that are known for having openings along their skin that allow them to filter feed. Right, so as water passes through them, if you remember the video, remember how the guy he put that dye next to the sponge, and then the sponge sucked the water through and then out the opening. So remember, that's what we call filter feeding. the sponge filters plankton and stuff out of the water, and that's how they get their energy. So a couple of things about the sponge is that they exhibit no symmetry, so you can't cut them in any way, and they have two mirrored halves. No cephalization, and this is because they don't have a brain or nervous system or a gut or heart or anything. They have very few specialized structures. The only thing they'll have is something called guard cells that allow them to, that have basically cilia that allow them to move the water and catch for food. They also have these skeletal structures called spicules, but you don't really need to know that. And like it says, they're all sponges that live in water. Then you have cnidarians. Cnidarians are known for their special stinging cells called the cnidocytes. Remember, we watched the video of how these cnidocytes fire out, and they're kind of like a harpoon with a rope on them, and they basically catch their prey and release that venom that allows them to eat their prey. And they're known for stinging cells. So all cnidarians are capable of stinging. An example of cnidarians are things like jellyfish, anemones, and even coral are going to be classified as cnidarians. Right? And they do exhibit radial symmetry, meaning that they can be cut in more than just one line. So they can have at least two lines that can cut them into perfect mirrored halves. Typically, they'll have more upwards of like 5. Then you have worms. You have worms. You guys know what worms are. They have bilateral symmetry, meaning that you can only cut them one way. There are a few different types of worms: flatworms, roundworms, and segmented worms. You don't have to know in detail what these 3 different worms are, but let's keep going. Then you have echinoderms. Echinoderms are known for the fact that they have that bumpy skin. Okay, and like it says there, most of them have radial symmetry. An example of a echinoderm is going to be a starfish, or the proper name being a sea star, right? And they have 2 feet and stuff like that that allows them to move. But yeah, those are echinoderms. They're known for their bumpy skin, and they have radial symmetry. Then you have mollusks. You have 3 different types of mollusks. You will be expected to remember these for your final. You have gastropods, cephalopods, and bivalves. I'll give you a second to think of those here before I tell you what they are. All right, a gastropod is going to be an animal that has a foot for a stomach. An example of that is a snail. So the belly of the snail is what it moves on. Okay, and that's called stomach foot. Gastro stands for stomach, pod stands for foot. All right, an example of that is going to be a snail. Then you have a cephalopod. Cephalopods are the really interesting group of mollusks that they've actually lost their shells, or they have the shells inside of their bodies. And examples of cephalopods are going to be things like squids and octopus, and they tend to be highly intelligent animals, right? Much more intelligent than other mollusks. And then you have a bivalve. Bivalves are the type of mollusks that actually have the shells, and they're known for having 2 shells. An example of this is going to be a clam. All right, so those are our mollusks. Then you have arthropods. Arthropods are one of my favorite types of animals to talk about. And arthropods have the most species of any animal phylum. So the biggest phylum or grouping of animals is going to be arthropods. There's a lot of arthropods. And there are 3 different types of arthropods. We have insects, crustaceans, and chelicerates. I'll talk about those here in a second. So some more important stuff about arthropods, and this is the most important thing, is that they have jointed appendages. Now, the word arthropod stands for jointed appendage, and that's why that's one of the major characteristics. Jointed appendage is a joint in their legs. And arthropods is the first time that we see a jointed appendage. No of the other animals that we discussed up to this point have any actual arms and legs. Arthropods will also have an exoskeleton. That means that they have that protective armor. If you've ever, had shrimp or a lobster or a crab, you see that they have kind of like that hard armor. That's their exoskeleton, and it has basically the same function as our skeleton. It allows for support and protection. Okay, the first group of these arthropods that we're going to talk about is the insect, and this is the largest class of them. And what defines them is the fact that they have 3 body segments that are separated specifically into head, thorax, and abdomen. and they have 6 legs. So that's going to be the major distinguish between insects and other arthropods. And what you think about insects are things like ants, cockroaches, and stuff like that. Those will all be insects. Okay. Then you have crustaceans. Crustaceans tend to live in aquatic or marine environments. So these are arthropods that live in the water. Examples of these are shrimps, crabs, and lobsters. And the difference between crustacean and insects is that crustacean will have 2 or 3 body segments. All insects in general will have 3 body segments, and crustaceans will have 2 and 3. And the interesting thing about crustacean is that the head and the thorax are actually going to be connected in this specialized organ called a carapace. So that's the part that the head and the thorax are fused together. And most crustaceans are going to have more than 6 legs. They can have upwards of 10 legs. And another interesting thing is some crustaceans can have 4 antennae. So they look a little bit different from insects. And they also, live in the water. So if it's in the water, it's probably a crustacean. Now, there are some insects that can spend some of their life inside of the water or swim on top of the water. But if it's in the water, you can almost guess that it's a crustacean. And then lastly, you have chelicerates. These are arachnids. Examples are spiders, scorpions, and ticks. And like it says there, they're going to have 2 body segments. And really, I would say they're either going to have 1 or 2 body segments. It kind of depends on the arachnid or on the chelicerate. Okay. And another major distinguishing factor is that they'll have 8 legs. So they'll have 1 or 2 body segments and 8 legs. Okay. Now, what's the difference between these different groups? So an insect is going to basically, most important role of the insects is to be the bottom of the food chain. They're going to eat plants, eat dead plant material, eat decaying stuff, eat garbage, right? So they're going to be the bottom of the food chain, be decomposers, and they're going to be food for a bunch of different types of organisms. This is why insects are so important, because they are really, the lower something is in the food chain, actually the more important it is, because they provide a lot of food, or the transfer of energy from the producers into the consumers, right? So insects are really important for that. Crustaceans are very similar to that. They're going to be decomposers. They're going to eat parasites and stuff like that off other fish. And then they're also going to be the bottom of the food chain in the aquatic or in the marine ecosystem. So their function is going to be very similar to that of insects, but in the ocean. And then you have chelicerates. Now, chelicerates are things like spiders, and these tend to be predators of basically the arthropod group. And their main responsibility is to make sure that the insect population stays low. So they're going to go around eating other insects. Sorry, not eating other insects, eating other arthropods, and making sure that those populations stay manageable. Okay, we're going to skip that section there. All right, 10C, this is going to talk about vertebrates. These are animals that actually have a spine and a skull. All vertebrates have an endoskeleton. This is the fact that the skeleton is found on the inside of the body. And the interesting thing here is that these are going to grow, the endoskeletons grow along with the organism, unlike the exoskeleton. So there are a couple animals that fall under vertebrates. The first one we're going to discuss are fish. There are a few different types of fish. You have jawless, bony fish, and cartilaginous fish. These are really simple to tell apart. Bony fish have bones. And this is going to be the most numerous type of vertebrate and the most numerous type of fish. The majority of fish are going to fall under bony fish. Then you have cartilaginous fish. The example of this is going to be a shark. And these are fish that instead of having bones that make up their support structure is going to be made out of cartilage. So does that mean that there's like loosey-goosey? No. They still have a support, but they are more flexible. So this is why a shark could like make a U. It could like tail and head could be facing the same direction because they're not made of bones, they're made of cartilage. Now the difference between a jawless fish and a cartilaginous fish is a jaw. That's it. A jawless fish is also going to be have a skeleton made of cartilage or a very simplified support system made out of cartilage, but they will not have a jaw. So they won't have a mouth with teeth that they can grab onto something and eat. An example of this is going to be like a hagfish, and they're going to be more like parasitic organisms that grab on and suck the nutrients out from a host. So those are going to be jawless fish. Right? Then you have amphibians. So another thing to mention about fish. Fish are ectothermic organisms, meaning that they cannot control their own body temperature. Their body temperature is regulated by the environment, and specifically for fish is the temperature of water around them. Now, depending on the way that they were designed, some fish can live in different temperatures. So some fish are designed to live in colder waters, and some fish are designed to live in warmer waters. It just kind of depends. But they have specialized ways to regulate that by just being where they're located. Then you have the amphibians. Amphibians are also ectothermic organisms, but these are going to be really interesting animals because they'll spend some of their life in water and then some of their life on land. And they actually experience this process called metamorphosis. We also see this in insects as well. But what this process is, for example, if you've ever been to a lake and you see those little tadpoles, those are amphibians. And as they grow, they'll actually lose their gills that they have as tadpoles and grow lungs. They'll lose the tail and grow legs. And that's what happens in amphibians. That's going to be a metamorphosis. They're actually going to completely change. So they'll drop the gills, lose their tail, and grow legs and actually leave the water. Okay. Now they still are going to live around or near or maybe even inside water, but they won't breathe water. They'll actually need to breathe air. Now, breathe is a little bit misleading because some amphibians can actually allow for gas exchange through their skin because their skin is so thin and moist that as the blood passes near the skin, gas exchange occurs. But some of them have lungs where they can actually just breathe air. So it just depends. All right, so those are amphibians. Now, how do you know if it's amphibian? They tend to be smooth, even maybe bumpy, but they have very thin and moist skin. Right, so an amphibian is going to have thin, moist skin, and it's going to be kind of smooth or slightly bumpy. Some examples there are frog, toads, and salamanders. Then you have reptiles. Reptiles will not spend any time like living inside of water in regards to like having gills and stuff like that. They will always have lungs and breathe air. Examples of reptiles are things like alligators and crocodiles, which can live in water. Like they can swim and do stuff like that, but they always have to come back to the surface to breathe. Right? Like it says there, most reptiles have dry and scaly skin. This is an easy way to tell them apart from amphibians. So their skin is much drier and much rougher. Like it says there, reptiles are ectotherms, meaning that they do not regulate their own body temperature. So the way that they do is by their behavior. So their behavior changes according to how the temperatures change. So if they're cold, they're going to go out and bask, and this is what we see in turtles called basking turtles. If you've ever been to a lake or a park that has a lake around your house, and you see those turtles like sitting out on the shore with their heads out catching some rays, that's called basking, and that's how they warm up. All right, some different types of reptiles are things like snakes, lizards, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, and twatras. Okay, now crocodiles and alligators have some interesting things. Their bodies are covered in scale-like scutes. Now, these are bigger projections. So, like if you look at an alligator, you guys know what they look like. Hopefully, you've seen one. They have those bigger projections, and those actually grow way deeper. So they can grow out of the dermis, and in some cases, they can even grow out of the actual bone. And the difference between a scale and a scute is that a scale will grow back and will be replaced. But when a scute is damaged, typically it doesn't grow back and isn't replaced. So it's permanently damaged from that point because it grows from a deeper part of the plant of the animal. Another interesting thing is that crocodiles are the first animals that actually have a 4-chambered heart. Up to this point, a fish will only have a 2-chambered heart. Okay? And then a reptile will have a 3-chambered heart. And a crocodile will have a 4-chambered heart, which is really interesting. Then you have a turtle. Turtles are animals that have shells, right? Then we get to birds. Birds are the first animals that are considered endothermic. These are warm-blooded, meaning that they regulate their own body temperature internally by things like metabolic processes, right? Cellular respiration, eating, digesting food, moving. All these things cause the consumption and the use of energy, and when all those things happen, it creates heat. And all the adding of all those different structures, all those different cycles and things that keep the animal alive, that's what eventually gives the internal body temperature of the animal. Right, so birds are the first animals that are endothermic, meaning that they regulate their body temperature internally. So they can really go wherever they want, and their body temperature regulates it itself. They don't have to stay out in the sun to stay warm, or they can cool off by doing other things. Right? Birds have feathers. Now, this is the only thing that is this is one of the major things that are unique to birds. As you can see, it doesn't say their flight. So flight is not unique to birds. There are other animals that are capable of flight. Things like insects and some mammals are capable of flying. So that's why it doesn't say it on there. But birds are the only animals that have feathers. No other animal will have feathers. And then you have mammals. Mammals are vertebrates that have hair and produce milk. So the major difference between mammals and other organisms is two things. One, they have a mammary gland that produces milk. And two, they actually have specific attachment to the young. So placental mammals will have connections to their babies inside. So the mom will connect to the baby through the placenta and the uterus, and the umbilical cord, and that allows for the transferring of nutrients directly from the mom to the baby. Right? And the example of the mammals that do that are called placental mammals. And these placental mammals, the baby grows inside of the mom until it's ready, and then they give birth to live young. And this example would be a dog, cat, and all of those things would be example of placental mammals. Then you have egg-laying mammals. These are very uncommon. An example of the name for egg-laying mammals are called monotremes. These animals are the platypus and the echidna, but they're still considered mammals because they have a mammary gland. That means that they produce milk. But they're a little bit different. They actually lay eggs. So they're slightly different, but because they have a mammary gland, they are still classified as a mammal. And then you have a marsupial. Now, a marsupial will raise their young actually for a short period inside the mom, but it's actually the baby is going to be born and will have to transfer over to the pouch. So a marsupial's example would be like a kangaroo, little pouch that the baby grows in. Actually, the baby is going to finish developing inside of that pouch until it's old enough to come out. And that's the end of chapter 10. And that finishes our week of review. You won't have my class tomorrow because tomorrow is field day. So I hope you have a good day. Make sure you study for your final over the weekend so that you can do a really, really good job. And I'll see you later. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.